Hello class, this is your course instructor for CJ 526 and SOC CJ 470. This slide is going to review some of the readings for the first few weeks as well as address your responses to the introductory activity and the short answer essays 1 and 2. So for the introductory activity, I had asked you to offer your opinion as to whether you think the criminal justice system is fair or unbiased with respect to racial and ethnically diverse people. Well, the results of this are that most of you thought that the criminal justice system was not in fact fair when it comes to dealing with ethnic minorities. However, there were a couple exceptions that thought it was fair, but most of you who thought it was unfair acknowledged that it has always been the goal of trying to be fair in the Western legal system. And so, according to the research, if you read the paper by Sampson and Lauritsen, research suggests that by and large, the U.S. criminal justice system does do its job in an unbiased and fair manner. And this is according to the law. There is no laws explicitly discriminating against any particular ethnocultural group or race. And when judged by criminal justice outcomes, this is an important one because we hear a lot about the disparities in criminal justice outcomes between blacks and whites. However, as the article explains, most of this is a result of different crime rates between blacks and whites. And so the disparity in criminal justice outcomes is largely reflects the behavioral differences between these two populations. And it's fair according to the standards of history. If we think about historically other countries, including, just stick to the United States, how we obviously went through periods where there was blatant racial discrimination. And after civil rights and the ending of Jim Crow, much of that has been, that racist structure has been destroyed. But as this article, the first article by Sampson and Lauritsen points out, as well as other authors, there are still areas of major concern where clearly there is some bias detectable if you go through and crunch the numbers and do the research. So one of the areas of concern is the fact that there are lower clearance rates for violent crimes among blacks, that is, arrests that lead to a conviction. There's a lower rate of that in the black population and the white population, which is not a good thing because you want clearance rates to be ideally to be especially high in high homicide rate areas, because that will send a strong message of deterrence. And when those rates don't match the offending rates, it sends out the message that, well, you can get away with anything, or the system doesn't care about you, or it's actively seeking to destroy your community. Not good. That's a problem. And one could argue, well, that is a byproduct of such higher homicide rates in some communities. Cops can't possibly be responsible or be as good at solving all those crimes compared to a community in which the homicide rates are a lot lower, and presumably then you would have higher clearance rates. Others, though, would point out that this is a result of police just not putting as much effort in solving homicides committed by black people on other black people compared to whites committing homicides against other whites. Okay, so there's a contentious issue as to why exactly the clearance rates are lower for black violent crimes as compared to white violent crimes. There are also higher arrest rates for drug crimes committed by blacks, even though, according to most research, most surveys show that, in fact, it's whites that use illegal drugs more frequently and a broader variety of illegal drugs than blacks, but it's blacks that are disproportionately more likely to be arrested for these offenses. And this is the subject matter of Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow, and she goes on for several hundred pages, in fact, talking about this. It's a great book. it is quite controversial in some of the claims that she makes, that this is all intentional, it's all a new Jim Crow. So you don't have to buy that part of the argument, but you at least need to acknowledge what she has identified in this problematic area of blacks using fewer drugs on average than the whites, but more likely to get arrested for it. The conservative side of that argument is that, well, this is a byproduct of the higher rates of violent crime in these communities. That draws police attention, much more so than nonviolent drug use does. And so if you are unlucky enough to live in one of these neighborhoods and there's a high crime rate, a high violent crime rate specifically, and you happen to be just a peaceful marijuana user, well, your chances of getting busted for being a peaceful marijuana user are going to be much higher in that high crime neighborhood, because a lot of attention has been brought to your neighborhood because of all the people in your neighborhood that have violent designs on one another, and they're shooting one another. And cops are being called to the area by people within these communities. Hey, they're out there shooting again. You got to stop them. And so who do they stop? Anybody who's on the block. And if those people happen to have drugs on them, and they're going to get busted. So that may be part of the reason why you have these higher arrest rates for drug crimes for blacks in high crime violent areas. There are also known disparities in criminal justice outcomes for individuals with similar offenses, but differ only in their race. And so it's documented that for blacks and for certain offenses for Hispanics, there are higher or stiffer penalties than whites, even though they commit the same types of crimes. And usually these are for drug-related offenses where you see the disparity. When you get up to homicide, it tends to be the case that it's so serious of a crime, there's not a big racial disparity in how people are processed. But drug crimes, nonviolent crimes, juveniles in particular, the paper by Sampson and Lauritsen points this out, but there is some difference in how kids are treated if they get caught out after curfew. If you're black, historically you're more likely to be taken to the police station. If you're white, more likely to be brought home and saying, hey, Billy is out too late and you got to watch after him. Whereas the black kid is sitting in juvenile detention, waiting for parents to come pick him up, or waiting for the social worker to come pick him up. So overall, the system aims to be fair more so today than ever before in history, probably more so than lots of other legal systems around the world. But there are some concerns, which is why this class exists and why this is a controversy, that you do have some disparities in criminal justice outcomes that can't be explained simply by differences in criminal behavior in those populations. Okay. So thank you for the responses on that. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about your responses to the short answer essay 1. So some of you haven't gotten to this yet. It's fine. I am going to go ahead and provide my response. And this was regarding the article by Sampson and Lauritsen, that really long one that hopefully you've had an opportunity to read. I asked you what combination of factors make sense of the black-white gap in violent offending and criminal justice involvement. And they go through a whole host of different theories. I would like to point out just a couple concrete observations that I think are useful in trying to understand why it is that in some pockets that happen to be majority black, you have violent offending rates that are so much higher than whites. And a lot of this class does focus on the difference between blacks and whites in violent crime, because that's where the biggest crime disparities are at. There are differences between Hispanics and whites as well, but the disparities in criminal behavior and criminal justice outcomes are just usually not as big on average. So the question is, why is it that there is so much more violence in certain majority black urban areas? And it is isolated to certain majority black areas. It's not like pervasive everywhere you go. It's just these certain areas that produce really high homicide rates. One possibility is that there really is a weak level of informal social control in these communities. Sampson is a social control theorist. So his philosophy is that if not acted on by a more powerful force, our worst impulses to satisfy instant gratification usually get their way. And so we need to have good positive forms of social control in our life to keep us from acting on our worst impulses. when you look at any community, whether it is Black or white or Hispanic, and it has high homicide rates, what you'll often find is a relatively high rate of non-intact families, a lot of single-parent homes, and you also find a lot of a lack of employment prospects. And so the conservatives, of course, will want to focus on the high rate of single mother homes. They will argue that this is a cultural problem, particularly among African Americans, that no one is forcing them to not get married, and the intact family, according to a conservative perspective and the social control perspective, is your first barrier to preventing your child from becoming involved in serious criminal offending. Now, two-parent home may not prevent your child from being involved in petty crime, theft, and drug use, but shooting at someone across the street, that's pretty serious. And if you don't have, if the majority of homes in your neighborhood just contain one parent, usually mom, your first offense against young men acting on their worst impulses, you just don't have a check against that. What liberals will often emphasize in this is the lack of employment prospects, because we know that women are not going to be as incentivized to marry, and men are not as incentivized to marry if they don't have a regular income that's coming in. And so liberals will argue that this is a product of historical discrimination, that jobs are not located or available in majority Black communities, so that economic stability that especially women seem to expect coming from their husbands, that just is not as attainable. And because that's not as attainable, people still fall in love and have romantic relationships and end up having children. They're just not doing it within an intact family. And the reason for this, according to liberals, is ultimately the lack of employment opportunities. And there's also some truth to that there is a lack of meaningful work for many young Black men in certain urban areas. And so that's a problem. So women do a little bit better without regular work. Men, though, really seem to need full-time employment to keep their lives in line, to incentivize marriage and all these other forms of informal social control that keep us from acting on our worst impulses. Because there is a breakdown of the family in high crime areas, because there is a lack of employment that if otherwise it were present would have led to intact married families. What is required in these communities that lack informal social control is more formal control. So more social workers are needed to make up for it. More police are needed, more probation officers, a whole host of individuals that are not biologically related to these families are needed to come in to act as the parent. So the state essentially becomes the parent in these high crime areas. And again, liberals will probably blame the lack of employment. Conservatives will blame the breakdown of the family. But the end product is the same. You have a higher dependence on formal forms of social control to keep the peace, which is not ideal in a free society, not at all. So this is a problem that needs to be addressing. The second short answer essay question was on the article about who is more likely to be arrested for certain offenses? What is the risk higher for whites or Blacks given a certain offense? And so the question is, how might the findings of D'Alessio and Stolzenberg speak to the higher rates of violent offending among Blacks as compared to whites? Well, if you read the article, you know that actually whites are more likely to be arrested for certain violent offenses than are Blacks. This goes to the issue of the lower clearance rates among Blacks compared to whites. And this is a real problem. In a representative democracy, we would expect the law to be enforced equally across all populations, or at least in proportion to their crime rates. That's what we would expect in a functioning criminal justice system. However, the fact that you have a lower chance of being arrested for a violent crime if you're Black than white, that's a real problem. Because there is less certainty for arrest, this can embolden predatory criminals, in whatever neighborhood it might be. It emboldens them And it also tends to foster a type of ideal of self-help justice for settling scores and grievances. So, the police are no good. You can't call them. Don't even bother. They come here, that'll cause problems. They'll bust some other kid for a petty drug offense. And so you gotta, as a man, you gotta take care of your own. You gotta take care of yourself. And this is dangerous. We don't want a society that is dependent on self-help justice. We want the cops to intervene when appropriate. And this is an attitude that not only do you see it in majority black neighborhoods that have high crime rates, you also saw it in the Wild West. You saw it in war-torn countries. You can see it there. Wherever you have a breakdown in law or a breakdown in trust in law, you will see men revert to a kind of self-help justice. And this is not good, because with self-help justice, although it has a slight ring of being somehow positive, tends to be a bad place, because it makes everybody the judge, the jury, and the executioner, which in turn leads to higher homicide rates. Okay, so I think that does it for this particular slide. I may have not done total justice in reviewing both those articles in detail. There is also, of course, the other article that talks about sentencing outcomes and finding that it's not only if you're black, but young and black, you are going to get a stiffer penalty in court as someone who was white, even if you did the same type of offense. According to the letter of the law, you will get a stiffer penalty if you're young and black. And so make sure to read those articles, and I'll go ahead and call it quits on this one. Please email me or message me on Moodle in case you have any questions, and please go ahead and answer these questions if you haven't done so at your earliest convenience. Okay, until next time, bye-bye.